so we'll blow the man up and we'll blow the man down.
To beware, blow the man down.
And we'll blow him away into Liverpool town.
Give me some time to blow the man down. Give me some time to blow the man down. Give me time. Give me time. Give me time. Give me time.
Okay, so Rolf, why did you choose hand-to-hand naval combat for your research?
My interest grows out of my experience as a martial arts instructor and practitioner, and I've always been interested in the issue of how to order chaos, and naval combat is quite a chaotic scenario, especially when you think about the hand-to-hand aspects of it.
Why don't you give us some background for the basis of your research?
There's been plenty of research on the ordnance and the cannon fire aspects of naval combat and naval warfare in general. There's been research into tactics, sailing maneuvers, and how the cannons are fired, how fast it takes to reload, and all these issues. But all of this has been focused on ordnance fire, and very little attention has been given to hand-to-hand combat, which is quite peculiar and regrettable, since hand-to-hand combat has been the main way of determining naval battles until 1588 with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, which is usually considered as a nail in the coffin, so to speak. And so this is an issue that really needs to be explored, especially because this is the birth of impersonal warfare. It is really where military troops are completely isolated from one another and start to go away from melee combat and can rely almost exclusively on heavy ordnance fire. So it's an important transition, not only in warfare, but with regards to more fundamental questions, such as human nature. And it really deserves some more attention than it has been given in the past.
What do you hope to accomplish with this research?
My aim is try to explore or assert, more likely assess, the extent to which 16th century warships were specifically prepared for hand-to-hand combat, and what was its role in this time. It's a very important age, as it is quite transitional with regards to naval warfare, and we are moving from a time where things were primarily determined by hand-to-hand combat into one in which it's more determined by heavy ordnance fire, although hand-to-hand combat was never fully abandoned. It was used way up until the Napoleonic age and way beyond. Still today it's used. But it is really in the 16th century that there is just transition into a large dependency on heavy ordnance fire. So I hope to try to assess the role of hand-to-hand combat, especially after this change.
So what is your focus and objectives?
Well, first of all, I hope to determine some of the underlying principles that govern hand-to-hand naval combat, and some of the principles underlying this way of warfare. I also hope to assess the role the various features have to play in this scenario. Ship construction. I also hope to look at equipment, mainly weaponry, and the organization behind all of this. And then finally, I also like to look into how specialized this actually is, especially with regards to maritime specialization and comparing that to terrestrial warfare. And then later on in naval warfare, you'll find that there will be a lot of specializations with regards to to warfare at seas, such as cutlasses and these things. But it would be very interesting to see how hand-to-hand combat or how equipment was particularly specialized for these purposes in these early periods of modern warfare.
What's your plan? How do you plan to achieve your objectives?
I plan to use tactics as a way of approaching this question.
And by tactics, you mean?
By tactics, I mean the art or science of disposing military or naval forces for battle or maneuvering them in battle. So there's actually two issues tied to this. One is preparatory tactics. How do we prepare for battle? And then the second one is how do we maneuver these resources in battle? And I'll try to look at both of these. But the archaeological material will mainly concern the first issue, namely what is being prepared for and how it's being prepared for. And out from these observations, I can hopefully delineate to such an extent that I can make some concluding remarks on the operational tactics. One of the things you bring into a naval battle is, of course, the ship. And an interesting issue is how much of the ship has been made or been prepared for a hand-to-hand combat situation. There's various features you can look at, and some are more interesting than others and less obvious. What would be an interesting thing to look at is the effect of the tumble home. What effect does this have, and what are the consequences of employing extreme tumble homes in the ship structure with regards to hand-to-hand combat? Well, one thing is quite certain, and that's that it creates a distance between the ships. There's various other issues tied into this, but that would be an interesting aspect to look at. There are the fore and aft castles, which are clearly relevant for combative scenarios. There are various other superstructures, such as anti-boarding netting, which was now the cause of the drowning of most of the men on the Mary Rose when it sank. But it also had a protective feature, which is interesting to explore. There are also the blinds you can look at, which are set up along the rail, which can be used to one's advantage and to prevent people from boarding the ship. And such features on the ship itself is very interesting to explore. So how much consideration was really taken into this with regards to hand-to-hand combat? Another thing you bring into a naval battle is, of course, the equipment. What I'm particularly interested in is, of course, the weapons. And one of the types I'll be looking at is the bill. The bill is a very interesting piece of technology. It is a staff weapon with a curved hook. It comes up into a vertical spike, and from the back protrudes a small back spike. And it's made in a single piece of metal, iron, with a single cutting edge. So it has these various features and can be used in various ways. It can be used for chopping, stabbing. It can be used for hooking the neck or the limbs, the leg, for example. And so it's interesting to explore the different functional attributes of the weapon with regards to the ship, and what was practical and functional with regards to the different delineations of this combative scenario. What could actually be done on the ship itself? How much movement was allowed? There were hundreds of men on the ship. And in addition to that, you had cannon fire all over. So it's an interesting aspect to explore how functional the use of this hand-to-hand weaponry actually was. Another thing I'll be looking at is, of course, the very common pike used by infantrymen in European warfare at this time. And here the question is pretty much the same, but what would be very interesting to note is if there were any formations on the ship itself, because the pike, as it is a long lance, it would be interesting to see if there was no organization on board, how much of chaos it would cause, not for your opponents, but for your own troops. In addition to this, there are various other equipment that you could explore, swords, for example, and different preparations for injuries from these events, surgical equipments and instruments. This will also help to answer how the ship was prepared for these scenarios. The organization aspects of my research will examine the maneuverability of forces in battle and how this was achieved. What's very interesting to note is how the preparations themselves, how they delineate the scenario. So taking everything into consideration, such as the ship construction and the equipment and the whole scenario that is happening of boarding, then you can construct some general ideas of how hand-to-hand combat was actually conducted. So this would be a very interesting thing to explore with regards to organization. Some issues will never really be resolved to a satisfactory extent. For example, how much were these soldiers trained, specifically for maritime warfare, or naval warfare? Was it just terrestrial troops that were employed, or did they have some special training? Also, the organization will touch upon one interesting issue, which is how hand-to-hand combat was employed not as an isolated phenomenon, but how it was employed with use of ordnance fire, and how they coordinated this. Because these things don't work by themselves, but you need to take both into consideration. At the same time as you had heavy ordnance fire developing, you would also have smaller anti-personnel guns. So was the role of hand-to-hand combat only to sort of delay a boarding scenario and use mainly the cannons to fire upon the boarding enemy? Or did it have a more significant role?
So which case studies will you and sources will you be featuring in your research?
I will be looking at a number of sources. I'll be looking at the Mary Rose, and this will be quite an important component of my research, because this has actually all the features that I need to look at. There's the ship itself, there are the armaments, the ordnance, and of course the hand-to-hand combat weaponry. In addition to that, there's various other kinds of equipment that are interesting and relevant for my research. I'll be looking also at Scandinavian material, partly because Scandinavia was engaged in the Northern 7 Years' War, which was one of the first wars in which heavy ordnance fire was employed successfully and to a wide extent, because this was a war very much about the domination of the Baltic Sea. So I'll be looking at votive ship models from this period, in Sweden and in Denmark and Norway. I will be looking at some of the archaeological material from Christianshavn in Denmark, Renaissance ship, and also relate this to a 15th century warship found in Sweden. And the reason why I'm also looking at older material is to try to get to grips of what this tradition entailed and how it changed over the years, especially with regards to the development of heavy ordnance fire. I will be looking also at various treatises and fighting manuscripts from the 16th century. Among others, I'll be looking at Joachim Meyers from about 1570, and also naval fighting instructions, such as Audley's fleet orders. And these will all serve to give a small insight into hand-to-hand combat through historical viewpoints. I'll be using various historical sources, one of which is the Anthony Roll, which is a very important list from the 1540s of the Tudor Navy ships and its armaments, at the crew numbers, and various other interesting facts. Also, it has depictions of the ships themselves, among others the Murray Rose itself. So this will give me a quite clear idea about what was on the ship, because as we all know, archaeological material is fragmentary in nature. Some consideration must be given to historical sources as well, because often these are elaborate or inaccurate to some extent. So the archaeological evidence should not be disregarded as a whole. Of course, I'll be looking at experimental archaeology as well, and the conclusions drawn from this. Experimental archaeology is a contemporary or modern way of trying to recreate things from the past. With regards to combat, we can look at how do you actually practice with these weapons and make them effective. And so it's interesting to go into the details of the delivery of power, the timing of the weapon itself, the speed, balance. All these aspects are tied into combat itself. It's not just an animal getting a weapon and then knowing how to use it intrinsically. For this you require training, and sometimes very advanced training. So by training with the same weapons or similar weapons, you can get to come to grips to what training was required in that period, and make parallels that have some justification behind them.
So what have you found in your research so far that really excites you?
The topic as a whole is very exciting, I find, because there's been so little research into the area. But what I find really exciting is the ability to go into the most minute details and delineate the combative setting to such an extent that you can say actually how this type of warfare was conducted. And by pulling in all these components that I mentioned, such as the ship structure and the organization and the weapons, you can try to make out even some of the techniques used in this type of warfare. So really what I'm getting back into is how was chaos ordered in this sense, and how did the people in the past use their rational resources to try to order the chaos. So this is a very interesting question, I find.
to blow him away into Liverpool town.
Give me some time to blow the man down. Give me some time to blow the man down. Give me time.